For being such a patient audience. I'm delighted to introduce our Ship Owners Panel Discussion. With those bright lights, it looks like we're all going to be interrogated here today. The title is Where There's a Will, There's a Way, where the owners of the vessels will hopefully be sharing with us their strategies regarding finance, regulation, innovation, technology, and market opportunities. Could you... We've got a few people. We've got a small group of people having their own panel discussion there in the middle. So if you could just join us for this discussion, that would be very much appreciated. Now we have some representatives here of very prominent ship-owning groups and some larger-than-life characters who many of you will know. So we have, in no particular order of importance or seniority, George D. Gourdomichalis, Managing Director of the Phoenix Shipping and Trading Company, a former banker who founded his first shipping firm 15 years ago. Stavros Gyftakis, at the end there, bringing up the rear, CFO of Seanergy Maritime Holdings Corporation, which he joined 2 years ago after 12 years in shipping finance. Kosmatos, Corporate Development Officer of Tsakos Energy Navigation Limited. He began his career with dry bulk and tanker operations 25 years ago in Greece, also worked in London and New York before joining the tanker group Tsakos in 2004. John Platsidakis, former chairman of INTERCARGO, managing director of Anangel Maritime Services, involved in shipping finance in Athens, Piraeus and London from the 1970s, joining the Marmaris Group in the 1980s before moving to Angelikosis and Anangel. On my immediate right here, George Tsavliris, principal of Tsavliris Salvage Group, born in London into a Greek shipping family, studied shipping law at University College London in the early 70s, although his youthful looks belie this, working in the family shipping and salvage business from an early age. He's principal of the Tsavliris Salvage Group and chairman of the Tsavliris Cultural Foundation. From everything that we've heard at today's event, George, we're experiencing a sea change in regulation, funding, markets, technology, along with a handover from one generation to the next. Do you think shipping will be a very different industry where funding will be revolutionized as the industry becomes more capital intensive? Private funds might be inadequate to maintain the ships. How will the industry be perceived? That's also we need to ask ourselves.
Difficult question to answer. I'll start by being typically traditionally Greek, en either, or diou then either. One thing I know, which I know nothing. What we're seeing now is we're seeing certain fundamental changes in the industry, which are different what we've seen in the past. I happen to have the experience of being around for about half a century, give or take. The problem here, I think, is twofold. Number one, being negatively biased by what I heard on the previous panel. Shipping will always be a personal business. It can never run without passion, without personal conviction, to a certain extent of being a romantic as well. And this probably overwhelms all the issues which we hear about in terms of high technology, because at the end of the day, the human being himself is a piece of machinery created by God, which we have our own element of thinking.
So you're suggesting there's a new age of techno-nerds who've taken away your traditional shipping industry, the relationship of the man or woman with the sea, the elements, the seaweed, the sail, all that is going, and they're transforming it the wrong way.
No, it's not morning raid. The problem we have here is that we've got transition, and as you know, the shipping business 50 years ago was under-regulated. Today it's over-regulated. If you look at the situation as an example of the sulfur cap, which we're going to see in 2020, I mean, that's a nightmare in disguise. You know, however what your commercial acumen may be, whatever your technological issues or abilities may be, it still is a bit of farcical, because what we have here, we have high highly technical people who are literally improvising laws and regulations, and especially with the sulfur cap, where if you refer to scrubbers as an example, a scrubber is comprised of ignorance and hypocrisy. In the same way as I mentioned that the Bloody Mary has got tomato juice and vodka.
And maybe a bit of the Tabasco sauce, or is that heresy?
Tabasco sauce makes it even worse. But the point is that you still have ignorance and hypocrisy. Now, how can we have a 21st century with such amazing technology, with such infrastructure, with such knowledge, and make so many fundamental errors of judgment which are technical, because I'm not a technical person myself, I'm just going by what I hear from the technical people. So basically, I think we have to come back to basics. I do appreciate that with Darwin's theory, that the one who's going to survive is the one who's not the strongest or the most intelligent, but the person who's more adaptable to change. But let's make sure that the changes which we're seeing in the future, that we're going to see them more realistic. And the reason being is because, as I said, is the money will always follow a deal. You mentioned earlier about the element of financial resources. Money will always follow a good deal. But the point is that shipping is a long-term business and is only good enough for the guys who are looking at the long-term effect. It's not for the quick fly-by-nights.
But is that finance a major headache for you when you're forced to go to the hedge funds with their very different style of operating, where they're in the private equity funds, they might look at shipping as a distressed asset. They might do everything they can be doing to try and actually take control of the vessel, rather than giving you flexibility to pay the loan as a ship mortgage as a bank would do.
That's a very valid point. But personally, first of all, I don't go to the hedge funds. I mean, thank God I can afford not to. We're selective who we associate with and who we deal business with. Because when you associate or work with the guy who's financing you, you're effectively a partner. And you want a partner to have the same cultural background, the same personal convictions, and the same understanding for shipping. So all these hedge funds, as far as I'm concerned, I wouldn't touch them with a barge pole, personally.
How about you, George? Would you touch them? Because, I mean, the big banks, they prefer the big ticket transactions with the corporate balance sheet. I mean, it's not a problem for Maersk to get a $100 million loan, but how can smaller ship owners convince banks to do business with them?
Well, first of all, I think we should put things in perspective and in order. The various investors out there and the various funding sources, whether they're private equity funds, multi-strategy hedge funds, family offices, institutional investors of any sort, can and do and have invested in our business, meaning the shipping industry, in various forms. If you're equity, then you're equity. End of story. It's not a matter of you owe much, it's expensive or not, it's equity. And there are many, many cases, and we are one case, where we are running a fleet of vessels which is owned by institutional investors. They're equity, they have the risk, and they look for the return of equity, as would any traditional owner. On the other side of providing debt, that again is a matter of numbers. There are those who can afford, and those projects that can afford higher leverage and or more expensive money, those that cannot. It's not a matter if you're small, big, medium, or whatever. It is project unique, and commercial banks are still there at a lesser extent. There's a shift as to which banks are more active compared to 5, 10, 20 years ago. Obviously, we've seen giants like RBS exit the business, or Deutsche Schiffsbank, Commerzbank, and others. But at the same time, we've seen banks like Standard Chartered, Macquarie Bank, which are very large institutions, enter the business, and in a forceful way. So, you mentioned the word revolutionize earlier when you were talking to George Tsavliris. I don't think there's a matter of revolutionizing anything. I think the world is dynamic, it changes, and there are projects, people, and pockets for everybody's liking.
If I can bring in Haris Kosmatos, you were very involved in the corporate finance side of the business. You've been active in the raising of alternative capital. Can you share with us a little of the flavour of the currently popular transactions and the challenges which ship owners face with particular sources of capital?
Ship owners always, oh God, I speak and then my voice kind of transcends down the room. Owners always faced a challenge on raising capital, and at any one time in history, there was always a choice. There was always, if you like, a menu for them to pick on how they want to utilize the capital available to grow the business. And in the end of the day, it all kind of boils down to the risk profile of the owner, the company. It doesn't necessarily transcend from one generation to another. You might have a situation where the patriarch of the family, the founder, to be perhaps more conservative or more aggressive for that matter, and the next generation to be the opposite. And that would reflect the route that the new management, if you like, will take on the capital raising front. Today, there are a number of ways a ship owner can utilize to grow the business, and I think the key word here is to grow. If the owner does not believe in growing at this particular time, I mean, eventually you would need to replace your older tonnage. I mean, these are live assets. They have a lifespan, the vessel. So no matter if you're into growing or not, at some point you would need to go out and buy new tonnage and by default access capital. The plain vanilla financing always been available, always will be. The bank, the plain vanilla banking, the corporate lending. That will always be available. It's mostly on a relationship driven, and this is how it will be maintained going forward. Mm-hmm. There is no way around it, and rightly so. On top of that, and depending on how fast you want to grow the company, and particularly if you're taking a higher risk profile than a more conservative, then you can access the capital markets. There are ways to do that. Either if you're a private company, you can, as George mentioned, there are private equity funds, family offices that could perhaps, like the story that you will present, and they would like to be a partner with you in growing that vehicle into something larger. Being a public company, perhaps you have you have far more choices mm-hmm. to pick from. Yes. You can use your equity, for example, as a source of currency to print a new stock and raise capital. You can raise preference shares. Mm-hmm. You can do, even though you can still do them as a private company, but perhaps at more attractive terms. If you can do sale and leasebacks, for example. That's another form of capital. So there are ways that are made available. But in the end of the day, it all boils down to the risk profile and how fast an owner wants to grow the company, yes. and on whether they want to play the cyclicality of the market. So there is no kind of one-fit-all solution. Absolutely. It all depends on...
Yes, and if I can bring in John Platsidakis, because Stavros is talking about a risk profile. A risk profile is defined by risk. So you've represented the Greek shipping industry at many forums over the years. You're speaking regularly with all the owners. Have you come across many examples in the market when Greek ship owners have miscalculated costs, not been able to make payments, and then had ships confiscated because funds have not given ship owners any leeway with the payments?
Well, shipping is a very volatile industry. We all know that well. In the 70s, we had a very serious decline of the market. In the 80s, relatively recently as well. So when you come to look at the industry itself, you have to understand the risks associated with this volatility. I think the losses related to shipping banks have been exaggerated because, to my opinion, most of them are not really related to the ships themselves. I mean, we all know that a number of German banks faced huge losses in shipping, but those losses were not really related to the status of the shipping industry per se. It was the concept which was behind those losses was wrong. I mean, the KG system was wrong by default. And as a result of that, it created an over-enthusiasm to investors and banks, and they ended up in this mess. As George said, RBS was a huge lender to the market, but RBS didn't go bust because of shipping, simply went bust because of the over-optimistic and over-enthusiastic approach of the senior management to grow the bank itself, not only in shipping. You did refer to hedge funds and other players in the ship finance market. Of course, most of those entities did not exist in the past because some 20 years, 30 years ago, the hedge funds did not exist. So shipping, and when I say shipping, I refer mostly to Trump shipping. Trump shipping, being a global industry, is by default influenced by what is available in global financing. So as those players have come to play ball in finance, shipping is part of it as well. Now, whether this source of funding is applicable for shipping, that could be another question of yours.
If I can bring in Stavros, at Seanergy, you've tested several alternative sources of financing over the last couple of years. What have been your experience of these almost new experiments in financing?
Indeed, echoing my co-panelists, I mean, there is tighter capital supply from the side of the banks in the recent years. And as Mr. Platsidakis said, I mean, it's not only the poor performance of the shipping portfolios, it's also the regulatory environment and other factors that come to play. So in response to that, I mean, we have opened up to new alternative sources of financing. We have tested both the Chinese leasing model. We have tested also the synthetic leasing model with one of our major charterers. And we have also done one financing with one of the alternative lending platforms, the so-called debt funds. It's important, I mean, to take a portfolio approach toward your financings. So in isolations, each of those alternatives have drawbacks and benefits. But if you take a holistic approach, I think that various options can counterbalance themselves. So for example, alternative debt platforms are the pricing is on the expensive side, on the higher side of the spectrum. On the other hand, they offer flexibility, the speedy execution and speedy approval. So it's a very good tool, I mean, to use when you want to grow the company, as Harry said, in the lower side of the cycle. The Chinese, they compare well in terms of pricing with the traditional lenders. You need more time. I mean, you need to sit down with them, to educate them. So it's a better tool when you want to refinance a facility, when you know that the balloon is coming up in 6 months or a year from now. And the more innovative transactions, like synthetic sale and leasebacks, I mean, when you want to commit a vessel long-term with a charterer, they can provide the financing at very cheap pricing because they're basically using the balance sheet and they're putting the credit, I mean, on the line for you.
George spoke about regulation as a pressure in tandem to financing and the 2020 regulations in particular, the fitting of scrubbers. John, if I can bring in you about this, the obligation to fit scrubbers. I mean, I did a quick internet search last night, and there's a huge variety of mail order companies offering plug-and-play solutions, compact systems, easy installation with casing, easy payment plans for scrubbers, you know, for these air pollution control devices, the open loop or closed loop versions. John, are these often regulations for regulation's sake? Are we just being politically correct about enforcing installation of open loop scrubbers which grab nitrous and sulfur as exhaust emissions and then just basically eject them into the water? So, I mean, if we are paying $2 million to $5 million per scrubber, it's just literally money down the drains.
First of all, regarding the first bunch of people, certainly they're not ship owners. They're just, they sell their own products.
Absolutely. They're trying to sell them to you guys, exactly. Yes.
I think the market has been hugely misled by this discussion about scrubbers. Scrubbers is a byproduct of legislation. So instead of talking about the legislation itself, we're talking about one way of how to address this legislation. I think the discussion about it is far too much. I will say the following. It is a decision that the ship owner has to take related to the operation of his ships. And as we say, there are many ways to go to Mecca. Scrubber is one of them. If people believe that they can do it otherwise, by all means, they have to be respected. But they have to know. People, in my opinion, that have invested in scrubbers, first of all, we are talking about substantial amounts of money. they don't know whether the money will pay, this investment will pay back. But I compare this expenditure to the premiums you pay when you take a life insurance policy. You don't take it because you know that you will die. You take it in case it's needed.
Or because it's been sold to you by an unscrupulous salesman.
Could be. So if it doesn't pay, I mean, if you don't pass away, it's a waste of money, the premium. It's the same thing with scrubbers. It's a life insurance policy. You spend the money, compare that to premiums, in case there is no availability of 0.5 bangers, and if the price differential ends up making your ship non-competitive. If there is plenty of 0.5, if the price differential between 3.5 and 0.5 is very minimum, then it's a waste of money. But if not, it will prove to be a very successful investment. But it's not, I mean, the politicalization of scrubbers is wrong. The regulation is politicalized.
What do you...
And you did say whether those are correct or not. This is a huge subject to talk about it. Overall, as a statement, no, it's not correct. The reason being that most of those regulations do not address the practical implementation of the regulation. It just come up with the regulation without actually asking the industry whether they can live with it.
And the other option, thank you very much, John. The other option, the fuels, the extra low sulfur fuels, are they worth investing in if they're 3 times the price of the alternatives? Is there pressure from the charterers who may be paying for the fuel to perhaps use the polluting fuels rather than the more environmentally friendly fuel?
I'll take it if you want me to, Haris.
What are you starting
If I may, just to add on and take
Please
off
come in.
where John
yes.
left off, there's no obligation to install scrubbers. There's no obligation to comply with IMO 2020.
Yes.
Interestingly enough, it's a regulation which we already comply with when we trade in ECA zones. I remind you, all of continental Europe, the British Channel, all of coastal the USA, US Gulf, most of China, coastal, etc., are already ECA zones. We comply. So that has to be clear. There is no issue by a charterer pressuring an owner to use non-environmentally friendly fuels. I don't think that I've never heard of anything like it, and it would be preposterous to even think that there is something like that. What charterers want and what owners want are to run efficient ships in the cheapest possible way, in an environmentally friendly way, and adhere to all regulations and go the extra mile when we can. There are many ways of doing that. One of them is scrubbers, as John said. For me, scrubbers are a commercial decision, neither a technical nor a regulatory decision. It's a commercial decision. You can burn very low sulfur bunker fuels, fuel oil. There are issues there because it's a new product. There are issues in distillates, there are issues in compatibility, there are issues in availability, but these things are all expected, and we've seen them in the past in the markets, and markets have a fantastic capacity of normalizing things. And yes, there will be volatility. Yes, there will be a price differential in the beginning. It's a bet whether this price differential will fall in 6 months, in 3 months, in a year, in 2 years, in whatever, but it will happen, as it has happened, because where there's demand for bunker fuels of that sort, which there is, there will be supply. The majors are not silly people. They are smart, and they will bring the product to market. And as far as charters are concerned, they want you to comply. If they need to run their vessels in ECA zones, as many of them do now, it goes in the calculation, and you move on.
Did you want to come in, Haris?
Please.
Very briefly, John.
Yuri.
Yes, and
May I
then
add something
Haris.
without
He's been
disrespect?
waiting very patiently.
You know, one of the most environmentally friendly fleets was operated in this area some 2,500 years ago. Sails and rows. Okay, thank you.
I just want to add that we have endless debates on the scrubber question, on whether it will be something that will make sense eventually or not. I mean, it's ironically, we're at a very early stage to know, and sometimes I compare it to your iPhone. You know that a few years ago, or a few months for that matter, you order an iPhone, and by the time you take delivery of it, it's kind of obsolete. And we all remember the big phones and how small they have become today. Similarly with the scrubbers, I mean, everybody talks about installing this huge machinery on top of a vessel that was not designed to carry that infrastructure on top of it. A very expensive investment indeed. We need to see, it's kind of new on whether it will pay back the investment as people estimate in the next 2 to 3 years. By that time, we need to see on whether the price differential will be at such a level on whether to make it totally insignificant or irrelevant going forward. However, and there are other collateral issues that need to be addressed. First of all, the open loop, the closed loop. I mean, the most hypocritical design today is the open loop, because on the one hand, you're protecting the air, but you're dumping everything in the sea. You need to make sure that the receiving ports will have adequate reception facilities to get all that.
We've got to think about CO2 emissions as well, haven't we?
Absolutely.
Charis, that's perhaps more of a long-term problem. And what does that mean? Changing the technology of the propulsion of the vessels?
I think for some reason everybody sees, because it's when, God forbid, an accident happens. I mean, nobody cares, nobody views shipping as an industry, kind of a day-to-day industry, but then an accident happens and it's all over the news, and we see all these ugly pictures of oil birds and things like that in a way taints the perception that the man on the street has for the industry, which is totally wrong. However, one collateral benefit this argument has, on the scrubber argument has, and the expense that it entails, is that it will accelerate the departure of older tonnage, more inefficient tonnage, and that's a benefit. It will improve supply. And as we know, the shipping cycles to a large extent have been influenced not so much by the price of oil, but by supply demand. It's a pretty basic industry. Nothing, these are the main drivers. How many vessels are coming into the fleet? How many vessels are departing the fleet? So potentially, we are in a situation where on crossroads that the market will skyrocket only by the departure of vessels that they cannot afford to have that structure on it. For older vessels, it will be hugely expensive to operate to use non-0.5. They will have to, alternatively, a potential alternative would be to slow steam. So again, by default, that takes out capacity. So all in all, it assists, it helps this scrubber debate and the implementation in 2020. It will really help the industry, and we're beginning to see evidences of that, particularly in the tanker market, as the order book has declined over the last couple of years, which was the main determinant of the weakness in the market that we experienced. We are beginning to see now vessels over 15 years of age becoming less attractive and competitive, and they are slowly departing the fleet for the benefit of the rest of us.
But George, can I ask you something? It's not just ecology, thank you, Charis, it's not just ecology, finance and technology. There's a much bigger issue here. It's the whole rules of business and society as we know it are changing. How does that really big change in the way we live our lives, the rules that we adhere to, how is that affecting the shipping business?
I'll try and be short and sweet on that. First of all, I want to comment about what Mr. Platsidakis said about the commercial decision around the scrubbers. It's nothing to do with the environment, it's to do with the commercial considerations. Secondly, just a small point, which you brought in the aspect of CO2. Yep. By trying to resolve the sulfur problem, you've got a higher energy burning level. So if you listen to the likes of people like Professor Dinos Arkoumainis, he will tell you that you're increasing the CO2 by trying to resolve the problem of low end reduction. So it's a bit of a catch-22 situation. One further point on the same issue to get into the financial aspects is that disregarding scrubbers and all this, why not just go to the bankers? This is supposed to be a financial scheme here, and just hedge the bet. Go and get a sophisticated banker who can buy the fuel forward, and you can hedge the bet on fuel, which can resolve all these problems about these complicated technical aspects of scrubbers. But back to the question now you mentioned is that there's a definite change, but one thing I think will remain the same. Historically, if you go back to 1955, since 1955, there's only been 12% of the companies which were on the Fortune 500 still exist. Now that basically, the inference there is that people here, which were mostly shipping families here, and we've got a younger generation out there as well, which is mostly younger generation, from that point of view, shipping in Greece will prevail. We will survive.
So the Greek companies are all surviving, and the rest of them are maybe under more threat.
But one basic prerequisite, which I like to say loud and clear because, as I say, I'm fairly passionate about what I feel, is that the younger generation, they've got to literally be able to dare and take risks. Everything we've heard here, we're trying to analyze things. I personally think we've been over-analyzing, and as I say, over-analysis leads to paralysis. Now, the point is that at the end of the day, the traditional Greek shipping families, the likes of Angelikousis, who Yanni works with, Nikos Tsakos, the traditional families existed and still prevail and will continue basically because they were passionate, they were hard workers, and they actually took risks. You can't today, because I heard the earlier session we heard about with technical elements, you can't overanalyze things and find what one should do and what one shouldn't do, which puts you in a predicament of not being able to make a decision maker. You decide, you go forward, and if you're on a shipping market, buy the rumor and sell the fact, which basically means when the market is low and everybody's desperate about there's no future, go and buy it and you can't lose.
This is where I want to bring in Stavros. Bearing in mind we're coming out of a long period of market lows, when we're looking at George's philosophy, what is the likelihood of returning back to some sort of mid-cycle normality?
Personally, I believe that, it's inevitable at some point to return to mid-cycle levels. We've been, the returns that shipping investors have been experiencing for the last 3 or 5 years are not sustainable anymore. But, the question is, how will this happen? And I think that the answer is supply. All the crises and the booms in shipping are supply-driven. So eventually, the answer will come from the supply side. And as all others said before, scrubbers, the new regulations, ballast water treatment systems, are going to be causing squeeze on the supply side going forward. In the short run, be it because of vessel stoppages, to install scrubbers, to clean fuel tanks for the new compliant fuel, or because of slow steaming going to 2020. So the answer would come from the supply side, and I think that we are going to be looking at better markets going forward.
If I can bring in George, is the main support for the shipping market really coming from China? How will the changing economic model there, as we move away from manufacturing and export to domestic consumption, how will that affect the shipping industry?
If you think 2 or 3 days ago, the latest information stats out of China, with, of course, the reservation of whether the numbers are correct or not, is that China experienced the slowest quarterly growth in the past 10, 15 years or something like that. And that was 6.6%, which is pretty much more than double than what Europe is doing, and about time and a half or nearly double than what US is doing. So the answer is China remains very important in the market. Whether or not it has transformed itself to what you described is questionable. I think that'll take a longer time than what we think. But it's not only China, it is Southeast Asia, it is the Arabian Gulf, which is a hotbed of activity. And interestingly enough, even though we are all talking about return to mid-cycle averages, unfortunately the past few months, the experience is that we're going closer to the lows of 2016 than mid-cycle recovery. And the Arabian Gulf and the Middle East remain probably one of the most active areas in the world. The US, I think, has always been an extremely important player in the market because of a number of reasons. Not only are we a dollar industry, but so are commodities. And China is becoming a dollar economy as well. And I think this is a very interesting twist, and it will affect financing and the capacity and availability of financing in China. And I don't think that we're going to see change in the market because of that. Changes in the market have happened over the past few years because of new trade routes, because of new goods, because of new infrastructure imports, because of increased investment, mainly coming from the Far East and other parts of the world, and other things like that.
So that whole China-US dynamic, John, which George is alluding to, we're seeing some price arbitrage during Trump's trade wars. Argentina importing US soybeans and then exporting Argentinian soya to China. So the trade wars, as well as scuppering some routes, they're actually creating new routes at the same time in terms of more shipping, more roundabout routes. Is that the feeling you're getting?
I think it is a typical example of history repeating itself. It has always been like this. But because we live these days, we feel that we live very challenging days. Always days have been very challenging for shipping, especially Trump shipping. So it will have the effects, it will change the trading routes, but life goes on, shipping goes on. And talking about sustainability a few minutes ago, I will say that it's not an issue for shipping. Shipping is hugely sustainable. Shipping companies are not necessarily sustainable because there is no substitute for shipping per se. The new regulations will certainly have an impact, as it was said, on older vessels, on vessels that they cannot follow the trend, whatever that means. Either because you expand the scrubber program of the company and it doesn't pay back, and so you have a burden to carry, or because you didn't. Overall, I think we have seen the fluctuations. The future looks good for dry bulk and tanker, I would say, as a general observation. Whether it will boom or not, I don't think anybody knows.
And to conclude our panel discussion today, I'd like all of you to comment just one sentence about digitalization. We've heard a number of presentations and a panel discussion about digitalization this afternoon. I was looking at some figures from the BCG consulting group about containerized freight in non-domestic cargo, and the revenues are 2.6 trillion a year. But much of this, I think about half of this, goes to middlemen dealing with customs, clearance, insurance transfers, bureaucratic hold-ups. Does the panel believe that systems can be put in place to simplify this process? I mean, the Munich Maersk, they're saying each voyage generates like a whole library of documents. In our lifetimes, can this process be seriously streamlined, where we have a much more digital shipping economy? Very briefly, Stavros.
Very briefly, it's a necessary evil. I mean, eventually shipping will turn to digitalization. It's not something which will come imminent in our lives. I don't think that it's something for the next 2 or 5 years, but eventually shipping will have to play along.
John.
With all respect to the previous panelists, and I do respect them, the fact that they are very technological people and they do sell technology products, I think they overestimate what shipping can absorb. We shouldn't forget that shipping operates in a hugely competitive environment, and therefore it has to adapt, subject to being satisfied and persuaded that it does make sense for them. It was said in the previous panel that one of the problems for this negative approach to shipping is the fact that the ship, the asset, is far away at a distance. It's not the factory next door. And it does have to address the problems of the sea and also of repairs. If something goes wrong, whether you address the problem. But the most serious problem of this slow technological enhancement in shipping is the fact that those products are to be served by the seamen. And those seamen are not necessarily the most technological people. And also they rotate. So it's not like we shouldn't compare our office where we have the same people, we have the ability to upgrade fast the skills of the personnel. It's not the same thing as it happens in ships.
Charis, very briefly, we've all heard about this Yara Birkeland, the Norwegian unmanned fertilizer carrier apparently coming in 2020. Japanese firms, Rolls-Royce too, they're developing these unmanned boats. Will that be the future?
I hope not. I totally hope not. I think it's very scary, all these developments. There is a reason why shipping is the first or the second oldest profession. And at the time, there was no digitalization or all these schemes that are infiltrating from all fronts. I think it's a quite complicated industry. Let's not over-regulate it, reinvent it, if you like. And in the end of the day, the more complicated you turn the industry, the less appealing it will be, and bring it back the finance question to the sources that you will eventually need to tap in order to grow the business and maintain the business and sustain the business over the next centuries. Yes. So if you overcomplicate things, I mean, in the end of the day, how would you convince an investor today to invest in what is supposedly a super expensive vessel with all these computers and no human beings at all, to invest in a project that, without knowing how, in a crisis situation, how things will be dealt. So all these are issues that worry me. It's kind of fashionable now to try to do everything through all this robotics and unmanned vessels. Next thing you know, we're going to have panels without people on. Here we might have robots talking for ourselves. So I think technology is good, but up to a certain point. Let's not overdo it. I mean, I know people need to think, need to advance, and obviously society needs to go forward. But there are other ways, tried and tested, that have taken society leaps and bounds ahead. We do not necessarily have to depend our lives 100% on technology. It's very scary. It's very scary.
Are you scared, George Gourdomichalis?
Am I scared? No, of course not. But joking aside, I don't think anybody's scared. I think we take these things to extreme. When we talk about automated unmanned ship, we don't mean ships without people on board. Right? Let's be clear on this. If you go to any university, any naval architecture school, anywhere in the world, you will see that the programs that the young students are following are looking at higher automation use, higher digitalization, new technologies, without a doubt. That does not mean no people. We need to be a bit, realistic and sober when we talk about this. Do I think there will be increased use of automation and digitalization? Of course there will be, as there has already been. John will remember 40, 50 years ago. I remember 30 years ago when I started working. The technology on board the ships, as compared to today and what is being built today, is a different world. The technology we use in our offices is a different world. I'm not that old, and 30 years ago when I started, we still had telexes. And today, we don't even have faxes anymore. Right? So things do change, and of course they will change. Will there be problems? Will it take time to adjust? Yes, it will, as it does everywhere. Has anybody talked about unmanned passenger planes? No. Has anybody talked about unmanned cars? Yes. And what's the result of that? Every company that rushed to try and do it, and I don't want to say names, had accidents on the street when they were doing testing, and they pulled the programs. We're not ready for it. We will be in 5, in 2, in 10 years. I don't know when it comes. Equivalently, things will happen in shipping. But we don't need to rush. We need to be sober about it and to understand what we're talking about. We're not taking out human beings from the process of production and service. What we are doing is providing tools for human beings to do their job better and more efficiently.
Excellent.
Sorry, before Mr. Tsavliris, and there are social issues that need to be addressed. I mean, each vessel has 20, 25, 28 people on board. I mean, we as a company employ close to 3,000 seafarers all around the world. What are you going to do with these people if overnight the vessel would not need them? Somehow society has to absorb them. Is society ready Are there infrastructures are in place to somehow use the skills of those people? What are you going to do? So there are all these collateral issues that need to be addressed, which it seems to me that they are not. I mean, people are trying to rush to move forward without thinking what you're leaving behind. And that's when I mentioned the scary term, that's...
Absolutely. The final word to George Tsavliris.
Very simple. First of all, I endorse what Yanis Platsidakis mentioned earlier. I mean, he's really more factually correct about all these things. George Gourdomichalis, I think, hit the nail on the head. My message, because I've got a young audience out here, is that I don't really believe in technology in full scale, because I feel that all the digitalization was improvised and made by the human being. The human being is basically irreplaceable. Look at the plane crash in the Hudson River, where the pilot defied all technology, all renovation, and took the plane in his hands and saved the lives, which would not have been saved had he not taken the plane in his own life. And my message to the audience, because there are young people out here, is be enthusiastic, don't listen to logic, do what you feel like, go by your heart feelings, and do what your gut feeling says. And that's all right.
And there's a rumor in the market that you're going to go with your gut feelings and buy some more ships.
I always listen. I've never gone by logic. I don't think I've done anything logical in my life, ever.
We know, George. That's why we love you.
So we'll be very much watching this space. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for all our panelists.